Okay, take 3. If any of you intrepid audience members are still hanging in there, we're so glad because this is going to be good. This is my good friend Kay Yerkovich. Kay is, pardon me, she's a specialist in attachment theory. She's a marriage and family therapist and has been in practice a long time. She and her husband Mylan are popular speakers and lecturers on the subject of marriage and family relationships, parenting. She's written a book. She and her husband have written a book called How We Love. She told me that this is the old copy, so if you go to look for it, it's going to look different. But this is my author autographed copy, so I have to keep it. They've also written a great book called How We Love Our Kids, and both of them have been very instructive for me and Rick, particularly as it relates to conflict, because we have had a lot of conflict through our marriage. We're very different. We were not taught how to deal with conflict. I don't know if you were.
No.
Yeah, most of us are not, and the things that we did learn in our families of origin were not helpful in our marriage. And I really think, I was telling Kate earlier, that if I could have a do-over in my marriage, I would learn about conflict resolution earlier and maybe save us some of the pain and terrible times, actually, that we've had in conflict. So we wanted to talk about that today. But the thing about conflict, it's inevitable. Every relationship has it. Yes. I mean, it's not like you can ever get to the place in which you never experience conflict.
If you don't have it, it means you're not honest.
Well, that's true.
You know, sometimes you have to learn to be honest, and then you're going to experience conflict. But conflict is inevitable. You either ignore it or you deal with it.
So give us just some high-level thoughts here as we start about conflict, particularly about what do we even mean by conflict resolution. What's the goal of it? Is it like to be in perfect harmony with each other?
No, I don't think you can ever be in perfect harmony, but I think the goal of conflict resolution is to really, the end result is intimacy. If you have a conflict with someone and you can talk it through and you can reach levels of understanding and you can work towards a place where you both feel like it's a win-win, most of the time, not all the time, then you're going to build intimacy in your relationship. If you can't resolve conflict, it's going to cause distance and it's going to cause hurt that is unresolved. And so it's either pulling you apart, and good conflict resolution will pull you together. And that's why it's so important.
Yeah, it is. And would you just say that, I mean, I'm guessing that often when people come to you, when couples come to you, that's one of the primary things you have to help them with is how they handle conflict?
Yes. The primary complaint in couples therapy is we can't communicate, which means we can't resolve conflict. But what we find is that it's the lack of skills from their own family of origin or picking up bad habits in their family of origin, and then not understanding, the root of that conflict in terms of, people tend to freeze when there's conflict and they can't get their words out, or they fight and they get angry, or some people want to detach and just get away. And of course, none of those things help us resolve conflict.
Well, so it doesn't build intimacy for sure.
No, it doesn't. So we have to understand, what's at the root of our inability and then move forward and learn skills.
That's encouraged. So I think what I'm encouraged just initially, and when I hear you talk all the time, is that you talk about skills.
Yes.
You don't talk about it in the reference of, well, just some people are good at this and some people aren't very good at it. You're talking about skills, and skills can be learned.
Yes, they can.
I'm grateful for that.
I am too, because we were 15 years into our marriage and we were the couple that ignored the conflict. And we didn't have honest conversations. So we didn't have a lot of conflict for the first 15 years, but we buried a lot. And so once we started being honest, of course, then there was a lot of conflict. And we had to learn new skills that we didn't learn in our family growing up. For some couples, it's a lot of loud conflict and a back and forth arguing, and it still doesn't go anywhere. I mean, with those couples, I often say, when did you know this argument was going to a place where it wasn't going to, there's nothing good that was going to happen? And they're like, 20 minutes before we stopped. So, even learning to just say, okay, we're going past a line where this is productive, but then we need to learn to stop and have sometimes a really set framework to learn to do something new. And that's what we modeled when we spoke at your mental health community.
I was going to say that. So for those of you that are in the mental health ministry at Saddleback, you know that once a month we have something we call the Hope for Mental Health Community.
Right.
It's changing names to the Hope Rising Wellness Community, but we'll get to that later. So Mylan and Kay were at that one in January, and they modeled for those of you that were there how to actually go through conflict together. And so some of our folks that are watching today weren't at that. So just maybe tell us a little bit of what it was that you and Mylan role played and what you were trying to accomplish in that for those who were there.
Well, the main thing that we were trying to do in our time frame was to help people understand that many times we don't listen well before we try and resolve conflict. And the Bible says, be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger, because anger doesn't accomplish the righteousness of God. But what if we don't know how to listen well? And again, in our families, either we were listened to deeply and we learned those skills or we didn't. So what we modeled was a framework of 11 questions where we start here to deepen our understanding before we try and resolve the conflict. Many times we're trying to have our way or tell someone their way is wrong before we really understand what's underneath their opinion and their perspective.
That is just revolutionary, because I don't know that until I really was listening to you and Mylan, I don't think that I got how much my own conflict style was pretty much about, listen, I've got all these words and all these feelings, and you need to know them, Rick,
right.
You need to know, or with my kids or in friendships,
right.
There have been times where it's like, no, I have all these feelings, all these thoughts, and I need to get them out, and I need to say them, and you need to hear them, and it doesn't really matter if this is hurting you when I say this, or this is offending you, or you don't understand, you just need to let me just like pour it out. And you and Mylan modeled a completely different way. Not that those thoughts and feelings that I had would not be important.
They would still be heard.
But the way that they're shared
right.
then is going to, if they're shared in a certain way, like even in the format that you guys talked about, there's a greater chance Rick would hear them.
Absolutely.
And be able to take them in and know me.
Yes.
And intimacy would be built. If I can follow you talk about being slower.
Yes.
You talk a lot about kind of slowing down the process of in a conflict situation.
Yes. So what slows down the whole process for us was learning to stay in the listener role for an extended period of time.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that in conflict, usually we're going back and forth. Well, you think this. Well, I think that. Well, that's not right because of this. But you don't understand this. And no one is really listening. We're just going back and forth. And so when you download these questions, and you can download them from freebies on howwelove.com, and you can probably download them from one of your sites
we'll
as
make
well.
Sure we have them too.
But there's a list of questions where you stay in the listener role through all 11 questions. And what that does is it opens up your perspective about what's inside. If I'm listening to you and I'm going through all those questions.
So just to make sure that we get the picture. So if you and I were having conflict,
right.
You have a format that you can download this ahead of time, kind of have it handy. You don't want to just say, excuse me, we're in conflict, let me go download these questions. But maybe have them already downloaded so that the next time you're in conflict with friend, husband, roommate, you've got those questions.
Right.
And so you're saying that as the listener, then let's just say I was upset with you.
Right.
You would, or upset in a situation between us. You would have this list of questions, and you would just have it in front of you. This is your list, pretend.
Right.
And you ask me questions. Is that the way it is? And then to hear what it is that's in my heart. But you're not, do you respond to me?
I only reframe what you're saying, validate when I can, and find out more.
Okay. So this is not a typical
it's not about
argument.
Me.
And it's not a typical argument.
No.
Because it's not back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
So my whole goal as the listener is to stay in that role and find out what's the conflict from your perspective, what are the feelings, where do you experience that in your body, what are the consequences from you, in your perspective of this conflict. I would be asking if you've had any feelings that are the same in this conflict that you had as a kid, because many times where we really get tripped up in a relationship is in conflict, we're stepping on a wound that's old. And so
say that again, because I think that's also insight I didn't used to have.
Okay, I'm going to give you a great example. We were working with a couple in a workshop the other day, and she said, what bothers me the most and what we have the most conflict over is your sarcasm. And so his next question he was to ask, so how does that make you feel? And you need a list of feeling words.
I have it.
Yep.
This great list of feeling words. You can also download
You can download that from freebies
helpful.
at howwelove.com. And he said, how does it make you feel when I'm sarcastic? And she said, angry. He already knew that one.
Yeah.
And then I said, go underneath the anger category and pick two more. And she said, belittled. And then she said, despised.
Huh.
And his eyes got so wide. And he said, despised?
That's a strong word.
It's a really strong word. And when I hear a really strong word, I'm always thinking, wow, I wonder what the history behind that word is. So as we continued in the listening process, we found out that she was bullied for many years at school. And to her, sarcasm was a reminder that she felt very despised in these episodes where she was bullied. So the minute he was sarcastic, she went back to an old wound without realizing it and felt a lot of feelings and got angry back. And when he really understood her history, he was like, oh, he had so much more motivation to work on his sarcasm.
Well, it sounds like what I hear you saying is, my first thought was, oh, he felt compassion for her.
Absolutely.
He felt empathy for her rather than maybe even defensive of, look, sarcasm is just the way I communicate. You know,
that's the argument they'd had for years. And this is the way my family did it. And I don't mean anything by it. But when he heard the wound inside, because he stayed in the listener role, his whole demeanor changed and his eyes filled with compassion and they really locked gazes. And he was just like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
I don't want to make you feel that way.
Right.
I would think it's would it bring that feeling of the listener of, oh, I don't want to make you feel that way.
Absolutely. And, you know, we all in relationships, we're stepping on old wounds, whether we realize it or not. And when we can slow the conversation down and we just have a list of questions, because what we found is we didn't know how to stay in the listener role.
Yeah.
That was something we had to learn that was very difficult. And then we found out when we're working with couples, other people don't know how. So, well, let's make a list of questions that gives a couple or a friend in a work relationship an idea of what it feels like to really listen before you try and resolve.
Yeah, I'm, pardon me, I'm wondering, you know, I've heard this enough, so it doesn't, I'm drawn to it now, but I'm trying to think maybe if this is your first time to hear this concept of having a list of questions that you go through, I imagine there are probably some people who would say, oh, that just feels so artificial, or that feels so contrived, or, you know, who's going to sit down with a piece of paper and, you know, go through these list of questions in conflict. So how do you address that when people say, that can't be the way to do it?
Well, what I usually ask is, so is what you're doing now working for you? And usually the answer is no. So I said, well, would you be willing to try this and see where it goes? And just see what happens. And people are always so shocked at where the conversation goes that usually that builds its own desire to try again.
I think when you and Mylan, you did a role play of that at our Hope for Mental Health community, and the place, you know, hundreds of people in that room were just almost stunned into silence because they could see the power of what it would look like. And they were, I'm sure, like me, they were thinking of, oh, that didn't look at all like my last conflict situation. Right. But how hopeful it was to think that maybe relationships could be a little bit different with that kind of a structure. But so then that leads me to the next question is, what if I'm in a relationship with somebody who will not even remotely begin to participate in that way? Maybe there's just too much conflict, there's too much hurt, they're not willing to do that. How do you resolve conflict when people, you know, either don't have somebody who will do that back with them? What steps can they take?
Okay, well, one thing you can do is if the person that you're dealing with is absolutely not willing, you can't force someone to deal with conflict. But I think you could even use this list of questions as a journaling exercise so that you understand, at least within yourself, what wounds are getting stepped on here? Why am I reacting the way I'm reacting? And that can even be helpful to just go back and say, wow, I had an insight. You know, let's say this woman had done a journaling exercise and could go back to her husband and say, I never understood this, but I think it's because I was bullied that I feel so
triggered by
your
upset
sarcasm.
or hurt.
And I've never made that link before. Well, that could be a new awareness for her husband, even if he wasn't in the conversation. So I would say journaling is a great way to deepen your own insight and communicate on a level that's beyond just reactivity. Whether your reactivity is to, be quiet or you don't have the words because you're scared or you're a fighter, you can gain insight from the journaling.
Would you say that same approach to somebody who, sometimes there's the scenario in which there's just so much bitterness, there's been so much conflict, so much rupture in the relationship that maybe the other person isn't willing to consider that approach? What if there's somebody on kind of the other side who just says, I don't even know what you're talking about. There's no conflict. I'm not upset. There's nothing wrong. And so they won't engage for a different reason. They're not even saying that there's conflict.
Well, that's often the attachment style of the avoider is like, what problem? Because the avoider doesn't have either lessons in conflict growing up, and they don't understand emotions. They don't know when they've caused a rupture. They're kind of just overall unaware. And it's not their fault. It's just how they were raised. But ownership is an important aspect of any marriage. And if someone, if you're married to an avoider and they just won't go there, then I think one thing you might gently say is, even if you don't think there's a conflict, if something's hurt me and I can't work that out with you, then it makes me feel more distant, less connected, and that's not good for our marriage. So, and I want to be able to listen to you. It's kind of an appeal for what you're left with when there's no ability to solve conflict. And again, it's how you say it. You can say it in an angry way. You can say it in a highly frustrated way. But the Bible says a gentle answer turns away wrath, that sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. So if you can do it with sweet words and tender words and vulnerable words, it makes me feel anxious. It makes me feel afraid that, I'm not going to feel close to you. Maybe you'll get a window. But boy, I've worked with couples where I worked with a couple recently and she had prayed for 33 years.
Wow.
And I feel like God sent this couple to me at just the time where he was finally opening up. And it was miraculous, really, because he was a very black and white, I don't need to talk about anything. All your feelings don't make sense to me. Why can't you think like I think? And,
so there's hope.
There's hope. And it's like, I feel like it really wasn't even just my skills. It was her prayers that God was answering. And I just admired her faithfulness to keep saying, Lord, I want intimacy in my marriage. I want to go deeper with my husband. And wow, that's a long time to wait.
That is.
But I feel like she really got an answer to prayer in that intensive. And I was like so thrilled for her.
That is so hopeful. I love that. As somebody who's been married almost 44 years and know where we've come in our relationship and the skills that we have built, through a lot of hard work, I agree that there is hope. Don't give up praying and don't give up trying.
Right.
On new dimensions and new intimacy in the relationship. That made me think of something a minute ago. What if somebody says, I just don't have anybody in my life? I'm thinking of some of the folks in our mental health community. Mental illness has caused them, there's been a lot of fracture in many of their primary relationships. Right. Some people feel very alone. And so they can hear this, and there's a yearning and a longing in their heart to have somebody in their life that they can have that kind of intimacy, but maybe they just don't feel like there's anybody that will go there with them. What comfort can you give to them, or how would you tell them how to begin to seek some of that with one or two people?
Well, I think whenever you have a learner's heart and you want that and you can express that to someone else, that's a big step. To even work through this as a journaling exercise and go to someone and say, I know I've burnt bridges, I know I've communicated in ways that weren't helpful, but I'm really trying to learn. Would you give me another chance? And I just want to listen to you. I want to understand maybe how some of the things I've said have impacted you. and go through this list of questions with someone else that you've heard. It can be a wonderful way. Don't expect them to listen to you the first time. You go with a willingness to listen to them. And that can go a long ways to, having someone give you another opportunity. I got an email from 2 widows who had no one to do this with, and they met in a grief support group, and they said, will you learn to do the comfort circle with me and go through this extended listening? And they agreed to do it with each other.
Comfort circle is on the back of this great handout.
We're really talking about just how to go around a comfort circle where you're aware that there's a...
Yeah, describe that. What do you mean by that?
Okay, the comfort circle starts, it's like if you look at a clock, it's got a 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And so it's awareness. I've got to be aware that I need to communicate something. And then engagement is just saying, will you take a trip around the comfort circle with me? Or I can tell you're really stressed. Can I take you through the comfort circle? Then you go through this period of extended listening where you find out more. And that's what we're talking about with these questions. And then after that, you start to talk about, well, how, in your perspective, how could we make this better? What would need to happen from your perspective that maybe it would be a compromise? Maybe it's just enough that you were heard. Maybe it would be comfort. Maybe it would be we agree to disagree. Sometimes that's where you end up. But I think
that, can I just stop you right there and then come back to the comfort circle?
Yes.
That has been a huge learning for me because of the way that my attachment style, it has felt most of my life that for there to be harmony, particularly with me and Rick, but I think in general in my relationships, harmony meant we see eye to eye.
Right.
And if we didn't see eye to eye at the end of a conversation, to me, it wasn't resolved. And so then I found myself, well, here, let me say it again.
Another way.
How about if I explain it this way? Or sometimes it was, well, if I say it louder.
Yeah, that always works, right?
Oh, yeah.
But you get frustrated and you're like, but we're not agreeing yet.
Yes, or I know, why don't you agree? So I must not have explained myself well, so let me say it again. And it has been, I have to tell you, my default in conflict is still, I'm a little uncomfortable if we don't see eye to eye or agree, but I'm learning to be okay and comfortable that is actually often great resolution.
Yes.
But talk
especially if you
that.
really have a level of understanding at the end of a conversation. If you've listened deeply, it's a little easier to agree to disagree than when you feel like you haven't even been heard.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think we have to recognize we're having conflict with people that have very different perspectives, and we're married to someone who sees things from a very different lens, and the lens of their own family history, the lens of their experiences in life, and we're not going to agree 100% of the time. It's an unrealistic expectation. I know. It's an idealistic expectation.
Yes, it is.
And so if we can lower our expectations to a realistic place and say, hey, if we're in harmony and we see the same way 50% of the time, that's actually a lot. Mm-hmm. And, especially when we're talking about preferences or, things that don't have a moral component to them.
Right.
I think when there's a moral component or where someone's really outside of, biblical guidelines that are an affair or an issue with pornography or, those...
You can't just agree to disagree.
You just can't agree to disagree on those types of things. Yeah. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about...
Politically.
Are we...
How we fold the towels.
Right.
Do we leave the dishes in the dish drainer or do we actually put them in
the
How
do we load the dishwasher? Where does the silverware go? Right. Those things are all cause so much conflict, but are they really that important?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we have to... I think we learn this with age, too. Major on the majors, minor on the minors. Yeah. We just need to learn to let some things go. If someone's offended you and they're highly stressed and they're having a horrible week, let it go.
Yeah.
Everything doesn't have to be an issue.
Conversation. Right. And I interrupted you on that comfort circle. You were talking about, slowing down, listening, and you were moving us around that circle there.
Right.
And I was looking for I'm saying, do you have to see eye to eye on everything?
No.
And you said no.
So resolution can take a lot of forms, and but many times what we find is there's deep listening that's gone on, with this couple and the sarcasm, they resolved it. He really wanted to work on that in a different way with a different motive because he saw the pain he was causing her in a new way. So many times just the listening is the resolution. But sometimes we have to go a step further.
Would you give different advice to, spouses, parents with their kids, parents with teenagers, adult parents? I mean, would you adapt this, or is it pretty standard, in almost every relationship?
Well, I think, with little kids, you're not going to go through a list of 12 questions. They don't have that capacity. But I think to at least define the conflict, talk about feelings. How did that make you feel? What do you think you were feeling when you did that? How do you think that made your brother feel, or your dad, or whoever? So that they start to learn that their actions and words have an impact on other people emotionally. And then how could you do that differently? Let's try a different approach, so that you're not just saying stop it.
Right.
You're saying let's have a do-over there. And you're actually guiding them through a way of doing it that mends the relationship. The point of resolving conflict is to mend a relationship. And one thing I find interesting is the whole area of apologies.
Oh, talk to us about that.
We actually ask couples,
because I was going to ask you about forgiveness. In fact, that was my next.
Okay.
Wow. Next question.
Okay.
What role does
it kind of goes with
that?
With forgiveness.
Yeah.
But
similar.
I don't care if you're dealing with a coworker, a spouse, a kid. First of all, find out if you're married to or you're working with an adult. What did apologies mean in your family growing up? Because many times no one apologized, or only mom apologized, or you had to apologize, and whether you were right or wrong, you only had to apologize to your parents, but they never apologized to you. So we want to know the history.
That's good.
Then second of all, here's a great guideline. Give a clear statement about what you're apologizing for, and acknowledge, at least guess at a feeling. I'm really sorry that I bit your head off last night at dinner. I bet that made you feel angry or upset, but I don't know. How did that make you feel? So you're inquiring about another person. How did my behavior affect you?
That's good.
And then ask, so what would be healing for, then you can ask for forgiveness. I can see where that would make you really upset, and that would make you feel like I didn't care at all about what even other people at the table were even feeling. That would be hard. I really want your forgiveness.
Yeah.
Any kind of touch. It's just like, I'm sincere here. It's a connection. Mm-hmm. And then, what can I do to make this better? Is there anything else I can do besides try and watch that behavior? Is there anything I can do right now that would help you feel better?
Something I was thinking when you were saying that is just how many times I've done it myself, I think, but I've tried to be aware of this because I know it's not productive, but have also heard other people say, I'm sorry
if.
I'm sorry if, but also, I'm sorry you felt hurt.
Right.
That I said such and such.
Right.
Without the apology first. So it's like a non-apology. It's
right.
It's like, I didn't do anything wrong, but you felt bad about it. So I'm sorry you felt bad about that. And to me, that's like, no, that's not an apology.
No, it's not an apology. Because most of us don't intend to hurt another person. I worked with a few people that are vindictively trying to hurt another person. And of course, that's not good. It doesn't go anywhere. But most people don't intend to hurt someone, but the fact is we do.
Sure.
And so to be able to inquire about their feelings and validate their feelings instead of telling them, well, I'm only sorry if, or I'm sorry you felt that way. They felt that way.
Yeah.
Take responsibility for how we make other people feel, because that's ownership. And an apology without real ownership isn't an apology at all.
And we know it, and we spot it, and it feels really hollow. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of one of those kind of apologies, it makes you feel, it doesn't help.
No, it doesn't help.
Soothe the hurt. It doesn't make you feel closer to the other person. It just makes you feel like either they were being prideful, at least for me, thinking they were prideful, or they're clueless, or they don't know how to genuinely connect with another person to be able to say, even if you don't think you did. I've been in this situation before where I didn't feel like that I did anything wrong, but clearly the other person took offense or was hurt. And so I think all of us need help in building that skill of, you don't necessarily feel that you did anything wrong, but the other person does. And so how do you negotiate that kind of conflict?
Well, that's a good question, because I think that kind of falls into two categories. If I take the time to listen and say, well, I'm not sure, I wasn't aware of hurting you, so tell me more about it.
Okay.
And how did that, you can even use some of these questions.
Yeah.
Well, have I ever done that before? Is this an area of sensitivity for you that I should be careful with? Those are the kinds of things you can ask to someone who, you don't feel like you did anything wrong, but if you understand more deeply, you might understand why they reacted. Mm-hmm. Then there's a marriage dynamic where one person always needs the other to apologize, but they never apologize. Mm. And of course, that doesn't go anywhere because, even with children, you've got to be on equal ground. If you want your children to learn to apologize well, you apologize well. If you want your children to learn to forgive, you ask for forgiveness when you make mistakes as parents, because we do.
Absolutely.
So I think, when there's never ownership on the other side, or someone's over apologizing or apologizing just to get this person off their
just
back.
For, quote, peace.
Yeah, there's a deeper rooted problem there. And, we need to understand what the deeper root is. But I think because some people apologize for everything, even when they didn't do anything wrong, and they're just appeasing another person.
Yeah.
And that's not good either.
And if you follow those list of questions, likely that's going to come out.
Yes.
I mean, because you listen to the other person, you're going to have an opportunity to hear even maybe where some of that. In fact, because that kind of leads me to the question of how do you protect yourself in conflict resolution? Because I think that there are people who are probably worried that if they really have conflict where they're just going to get more hurt. They're going to get more wounded in the process. So how do you protect yourself in conflict resolution?
That's a complicated question, but I'm going to just try and give at least a brief answer. Yeah. I think you have to be wise and choose your words carefully, first of all. Then you have to ask, does this person have the capacity to hear? And, there are some people like, I had a conflict with my dad over a comment he made to one of my daughters that was very inappropriate. But I was still very childlike in my relationship with him. And I took 2 years of my own therapy and hard work to learn to have a voice. Wow. Then I went back and I wrote my feelings in a letter. I started with what he did well. I ended with what the conflict was. And then I set a boundary that said, if that happens again and you make comments like that, we're going to get up and leave immediately, and we probably won't be back for quite a while.
Wow.
I hope that doesn't happen because we'd like to continue a relationship, but I did set a very firm boundary of what we would or wouldn't do, not what he had to do, because he could choose.
Right.
A boundary is about what you'll do or what you won't do. And at the end of that conversation, I think it was the first time I felt like an adult around my dad. It's also important before you wade into conflict to realize if the worst possible outcome happens, can I handle that? I had to ask myself, what if my dad starts yelling and kicks me out of the house and says, I don't ever want to see you again? Am I okay with that? And at the point that I had the talk with him, I was okay with it. So I think we have to ask ourselves, if someone doesn't have the capacity to hear, and we really are just going to stir up more strife, maybe it's wise not to have the conversation. If we're married to someone and it's the only way we're going to grow, then sometimes we have to take a risk, and yes, we might get more, maybe obedience is going to cause more suffering. But I think,
what do you mean by that in this context?
Well, for example, if I'm married to someone and there's been a lot of hurt and I'm just refusing to communicate because I might get hurt again, well, if we're in the process of learning to communicate, we might get hurt again. But the alternative is to be in a stalemate in your marriage.
Okay.
So I think, especially when you feel the Lord is really leading you to approach someone or to try and have a conversation, make the effort, because the Bible says in Romans 12, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. Okay. So I think God asks us to make our best effort. And, sometimes that's going to go exceedingly well. Sometimes it's going to completely bomb.
Yeah.
But we can look up at the Lord and say, I did my very best.
Yeah.
And if there's something I need to learn, send me help so that I can learn that.
So if somebody feels like that they do need more help, you've mentioned counseling a couple times. I talk about counseling all the time, how beneficial it's been to me. So, what is it? What makes it helpful for some couples? How do you go about finding a good counselor?
Well, counseling can be very helpful if you're with the right person. And so I tell people you're best off to find someone that's got the similar issue that you do. Like you want marriage counseling. Talk to other couples and say, have you ever gone to counseling? We're looking for a good marriage counselor. If you just start with a phone book or your insurance list, you're like...
It's potluck. You don't know what
potluck.
you're going to get.
You don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
And I always tell people within 3 sessions, you should feel like, oh, this is where I need to be. I feel like this person understands and can move me forward. If you don't feel that in 3 sessions, leave.
Oh, that's good.
Don't waste your money, because you should feel a sense of competence and like the person is understanding within.
But go more than once, you're saying.
Go more than once.
Okay. Before you make that determination.
Before that, make determination. I think if you're seeking couples therapy, I would advise you to seek a counselor who's more directive. The biggest complaint we hear with couples therapy is they just listened and said, well, maybe could you say that differently? Or there wasn't a lot of direction in terms of, we're here and we're going to move over to here and this will be helpful.
And here's how to get there.
I think it's not a bad idea to study some general principles or schools of therapy. There are so many approaches. There's a behavioral approach that just looks at behavior and changing behavior. There's a developmental approach, which looks more at your history and how is your history impacting your present life. I prefer that approach. There's quick solution-oriented therapy. There's trauma therapy. If you've had trauma, it's probably good to seek someone out who's skilled with trauma. But even just to Google schools of therapy, what one resonates with you? What one do you feel is going to best meet your need? And then look for referrals. It's the best advice I can give. Other people who've had a successful experience, you're more likely to find someone who's helpful.
Okay, this has been so good. So if I were just going to maybe just ask one more question as we wrap it up. As I said in the very beginning, neither Rick nor I learned good conflict resolution in our family of origin, and we spent a lot of years with a lot of pretty intense conflict. We're both really emotional people, very verbal people, and we've damaged each other in some of those years as we've been slow learners on how to deal with conflict. Yeah. But one of the impetuses, one of the reasons I think we were interested in learning some different conflict resolution tools is because we didn't want to pass on those really unhealthy styles and ways of dealing with conflict to our kids and we know how those things we know how it affected us. We didn't want to affect it.
So you pass it on by modeling, if nothing else.
So how just as we close, how can somebody begin to change some of their own unhealthy patterns so that they don't influence even nieces and nephews or other people that you were around? How do we change that?
Well, we like to encourage people to be a transitional generation where, but you have to understand, well, what did I come out of my history with? Do I avoid conflict? Do I get scared and want to just be nice and make it go away? Do I fight? Do I have a need for control for some reason? So I think really trying to understand what did happen in my family is a great starting point, because often that's just normal to us. And as we grow, sometimes we realize, oh, maybe it wasn't so normal. But as we're growing up, it's just the way it was. So I think beginning to understand, what's my history? What did I learn? Where am I weak in my conflict resolution skills? Am I dishonest? Am I a fighter? Do I need to tone it down? Do I need to be honest for the first time in my life? We've got to kind of start by understanding, where am I weak? And I think good conflict resolution takes honesty. It takes the ability to listen. It takes the ability to contain and regulate your emotions. In other words, I don't stop because I'm so frightened I can't go on, or I don't stop because I'm so angry I'm just going to start blasting someone. Learning to regulate emotions is a huge goal of conflict resolution. And by regulate, I mean be able to stay engaged in a calm zone where you're not going to derail the conversation through either avoiding, minimizing, or fighting. And, usually our dysregulation, those ways we manage stress, start early on.
Oh, yeah.
They start before we even have words.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I just feel like you've given people hope. You've just encouraged us to
If there's hope for you and hope for me,
Hope for me.
there's hope for anybody,
Yeah.
because we were 15 years in before we knew anything about how to manage conflict. And you sound like you were ways in too.
Many years and
Yeah.
stuff. But just so wherever you are in your relationships, you can. There's hope.
Yes.
Things can get better. And even as Kay said, even if you're with somebody or a relationship, or your closest relationships are not people who are very skilled at conflict resolution, you can begin to change yourself. You can examine yourself through some of those questions.
Right.
Through the book that Kay and Mylan have written, and really good tools in there. You can journal. Come up with insights. Don't give up praying for change in your relationships. Don't give up praying for change in yourself. Right. And
that's the most important. Yourself.
In yourself. That's the change you can control the most. And there are some good skills and ways that we can learn to be better at. And the goal, keep in mind that goal, building intimacy with people that you care about.
Right.
That's great motivation for me. It's not even just for me to change so that I'm better or different, which is good, but we all want connection. We all want to be close. We all want to have people that know us and that we can know. And that means getting good at conflict resolution. So good to be with you today, and we will see you, hopefully some of you, at the next Hope for Mental Health Community, which is on February 24th. It will be Facebook Live if you aren't able to join us in person, but hope to see you then.